exhausted their financial, material resources. They suffered many casualties, but Americans start to finally arrive in large numbers in the Western Front in early 1918, and so that's a very morale boosting event for the French and the British. The tide starts to turn in July, August, and then the German armies collapse in September, October, and their allies, and then an armistice is finally signed on November 11th, where the Germans essentially surrender and accept defeat in the Western Front in World War I. And so this slide provides you with an overall view of what's happening throughout Europe. In gray, you can see there the Central Powers, so Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, the Ottoman Empire. Those four powers were all allied, and then the Entente powers were the United Kingdom, France, Italy joined later on, Serbia, Romania, and Russia. So in the Western Front, yes, the Germans occupied Belgium at the start of the war and some parts of northeast France. Eventually, and so they kept those positions until pretty much the end of 1918. Until the end of 1918. In the Eastern Front, we can see how Germany and Austria-Hungary ended up actually occupying large chunks of Belarusia and Ukraine and Western Russia, and so in 1918, the Germans and Austro-Hungarians were actually seemed to have reached a positive end for them in the Eastern Front. They seem to have reached a successful conclusion for them. In March 1918, yes, I mentioned that the new Soviet government, led by Lenin, was already in control in Moscow and starting to consolidate itself. And so they signed a treaty where they agreed to give up to Germany and Austria-Hungary large chunks of what had been the old Russian Empire in Europe. And so that Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918 allowed Germany to shift large numbers of its troops from the Eastern Front to the Western Front to try to finish the war successfully for them on the Western Front as well. These are some of the events that were happening, some of the key events happening in Eastern and Central Europe. So yes, we just mentioned how the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was essentially a German victory. So with that treaty, the Soviet Union basically accepted the fact that Germany had defeated Russia and was willing to. So Lenin, partly to consolidate the power of the power of the Communist Party and the Bolsheviks in Russia, Lenin was willing to sign a treaty with the Germans that would give up to them large chunks of what had been Western parts of the Russian Empire, and so that was signed in March 1918. Of course, Lenin would still have to fight the White Russian forces in the Russian Civil War for another 2 or 3 years. But at least in terms of the conflict between Russia and Germany, that ended through the Brest-Litovsk Treaty. The Russian Civil War continued, and from a French standpoint, one interesting thing to keep in mind is that the French government and also French private investors had invested large amounts of money in Russian securities and Russian bonds prior to World War I. And partly because the French government wanted to help support the Tsarist regime, and so encouraged that investment. Now, when the communists came to power, they repudiated all those commitments to pay back French loans and to pay back interest or coupons on French bonds. And I found a New York Times article from November of 2000, saying that finally the Russian and French governments had reached an agreement 82 years later to pay back a portion of those French loans and investments. So Lenin and Trotsky repudiated those commitments, but the Russian government later on agreed to pay back a portion of that to the heirs of the original French investors. So the Central Powers started to collapse in October, November. So Bulgaria, Turkey, Austria-Hungary, Germany's allies start surrendering. Austria-Hungary was dissolved, and Germany also entered a chaotic domestic period. So Eastern Europe went through a large number of changes. Yes, and let me now speak about the impact of those changes and those events on France. So we mentioned how with the fall of Tsarist Russia, France lost a key ally. So before World War I, France had been allied with Tsarist Russia. Both Russia and France collaborated with each other to provide counterbalances to the German Empire. So they were allies. Now, when the revolutions in 1917 toppled the Tsarist regime, and then later the provisional government, and the Bolsheviks came to power, France lost a major ally in Eastern Europe, and so of course France lost its financial investments, but more than that, yes, France lost a strategic ally, France and Russia had been allied had a formal treaty of alliance since 1896, and so they'd been allies for quite a while. And the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire also created many changes in Southeast Europe, and of course the defeat of the Ottoman Empire, and the eventual dissolution of the Ottoman Empire also brought changes, and so France had to also deal with a very fluid situation in Southeast Europe. France still had colonies and financial interest in the Mediterranean, in the Eastern Mediterranean. France had colonies in Syria and elsewhere, and so France had to adapt to that new situation in Southeast Europe as well. The defeat in 1918 of Germany, of course, meant that Germany would have to give back Alsace and Lorraine to France, and also give up certain of its territories in East Prussia to the new Poland, and pay reparations to the Allies. And so that brought humiliation and resentment to many Germans, and so France had to deal with in the 20s and the 30s with the fact that many Germans wanted revenge and were angry with the settlement, and were looking for ways to change the World War I peace treaties at Versailles and elsewhere. So France had to deal with that situation with a resentful Germany, so France did get back Alsace and Lorraine, but it had to then deal with a neighbor who was very unhappy with the results of the war, and of course unhappy with the fact that it had to also pay reparations, what it was expected to pay reparations payments to France and other allies. Now, the United Kingdom and the USA, of course, had been allied with France during the war, and in many ways they had collaborated effectively. Now, one of the reasons, of course, that they've been allied is that Germany had been a common enemy. Now, once Germany was defeated, the differences in perspective between France and the UK and the United States started to manifest themselves more openly. So, for example, many French leaders wanted to take a more punitive approach toward Germany, but many British leaders and many American leaders were opposed to that, and so there was some friction over that. So, when you're in the war, you're both facing the common enemies, and so it's relatively easy to get along, relatively easy to work together for the final goal. But once the enemy is defeated, then your differences and your suspicions start to come out into the open. And France and the United Kingdom also had, before the war, had quite a bit of rivalry in terms of colonies and colonial expansion. And of course, the USA, President Wilson and other American leaders had quite a different perspective on European issues and colonial issues than many Europeans. France, of course, the end of the war, well, the whole war and the end of the war brought great deal of exhaustion and social and economic trauma to France. France before the war had been at about, the population had been about 41 million in France, but with the casualties of war and the much lower birth rate, after the war, France's population dropped to about 38 million or so. So the huge demographic impact, which was not only going to be felt right after the war, but was also going to be felt one generation or even two generations after the war. So France, by the end of 1918, France has to make these choices about what is it going to do with its own empire, with its own colonies. What is going to be France's approach toward the new German Republic? What is France's approach going to be toward the Soviet Union? So those were all important questions that the French leaders and French society had to address. And in many ways, they did not address them very successfully in the 20s and 30s. This is a map of what Europe looked like right after 1918. So Germany is a bit smaller because France took back Alsace and Lorraine, and parts of Eastern Prussia went over to were transferred to the new Polish state. The Austro-Hungarian Empire has completely broken up, and in its place we see new smaller states: Czechoslovakia, Austria, Hungary, Yugoslavia, and the Soviet Union. In 1919, it was still not absolutely clear that the Soviet Union would survive, because there was a civil war going on in Russia between the Reds and the Whites, which would go on until about 1921. But officially, the new Poland had already been created, and the Soviets the communist government would, of course, eventually defeat the white forces in Russia, in Russia, and establish itself as the Soviet Union. During the war, in 1918, the Allies had sent some small numbers of troops and some supplies to support white Russian forces, and to make sure that certain military supplies that the Allies had provided to the previous Russian governments did not fall into the hands of the Bolsheviks. So there was some limited and not very effective Allied intervention in the Russian Civil War in 1918. France did contribute some troops, but not many. So France's main efforts in World War I were on the Western Front, and also providing support also to Italy, and also providing troops in northern Greece to fight against Bulgaria. Okay, so now those were the slides that I was hoping to go through with you. Now, I thought I would try something new to try to make the lecture a bit more interactive, and also ask you to participate. And can I ask does everybody have their iPhone or text phone here? So I'd like to try something. It's totally optional, but I have prepared some questions for you regarding the topic this evening. And you can. This is a website called Poll Everywhere. You can text your answer. It's used sometimes for university courses to give students a chance to respond. So yeah, if you have a text system in your phone, you can text to Michael Hune 220 to that number, and then once you join, you can choose the answer. So it's active. It's active. So I think if you hit send to your text, the answers will just anonymously, the answers will anonymously display. Okay, sure. What's Kat? Yes.
D.
D?
Yes.
Okay, we have one D. Anyone else?
I'm still signing up.
Okay, D. Are you able to? I'm curious. Are you able to text your answer? Because if you answer, it should show up as a bar, like the number anonymously. It would just the number of replies should be showing up. Anyone? Okay, there we go. We have some answers. Which one do you think works?
Both periods.
Okay. Anyone else? Okay. So the answer B is the correct answer. Okay, we have. I do have a few other questions for you. Let's see. And this did come up in the presentation. 1918. Who was named Supreme Commander of the Allied Armies in 1918?
P.
Are you sure? Any other answers? B is correct. Excellent. Okay, so just I have another question for you. So Georges Clemenceau was the Prime Minister of France in 1918. He was nicknamed the Tiger, Le Tigre, and also Père de la Victoire, Father of Victory. Where was he born? He lived in the United States, actually. He was fluent in English. Vendée is correct.
Yeah.
He was from the Vendée. Okay, two more questions for you. So in 1918, the President of the Republic, the head of state of France, was Raymond Poincaré. Where was he born? Which region?
Yeah.
The answer is D, Meuse. So they had Meuse, which is part of the old Lorraine, and so there were some the stories that when he was a boy he'd seen the Prussians come through his hometown in Lorraine, and when they defeated France in 1870.
Yeah.
Okay, one last question for you, and then then I can take questions and we can talk about the presentation further. Okay, so this also happened in 1918. So, who did the Royal Air Force Force officially credited with shooting down the German flying ace, Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, over France in 1918.
Well, the British, oh, wait a minute, you said the British.
So the question is, who got the official credit for shooting down the Red Baron?
I think it was around, and then, Billy Bishop, finished it. That's wrong. Yeah.
Okay, so the answer is yes. Brown, Arthur Roy Brown, Canadian, was officially credited. So he was also a pilot, and he was officially credited with having shot down the Red Baron. Now, apparently, after many years after the war, people started researching that, and some people. So there's various theories about who really killed the Red Baron. Some people believed it was he was actually killed by a shot from the ground, by soldiers. And so Popkin and Evans were soldiers. I think one of them was in the Australian Army, another was in the British Army. And some theories even argue that he'd been killed by another German plane by mistake. So we've never. So there isn't a definitive answer as to who really killed the Red Baron, although at the time Arthur Roy Brown was officially credited with shooting down the Red Baron. How about Snoopy? Okay, so I'd like to open it up to any questions or comments. So we still have, it's 5 minutes past 7, so we still have a bit of time before the hour runs out, and I'd be happy to, if you have any questions or perspectives, it'd be great to hear, yes. Yes, I can, go ahead.
You talked about the mutiny in the French army.
Yes.
And it did in fact occur. But there's a Canadian connection here.
Okay.
And what it is, it's the Battle of Passchendaele.
Uh-huh.
Because Sir Arthur Currie, who by this time had gained fame as the general who was in charge of the Battle of Vimy, he was ordered by Haig to take Passchendaele after the British and the French failed to do so. He refused. Interestingly, he refused. However, he was told that he had to do it for reasons that were not, they were not able to tell him why. And so he proceeded. He predicted that there would be 16,000 casualties, and there were 16,000 casualties. The Canadians eventually did take Passchendaele, but the reason he was not told because of mutiny. In other words, the Allied forces did not want the word to get around that the French army had mutiny. It's a bit of a connection there.
Yeah, great comment. The British were worried about the mutinies of the French army, and the Allies were lucky that the Germans did not hear about the full extent of the mutinies, because if the Germans had heard about them, they would have attacked and yes, perhaps with success. So it was a very worrisome development. The French. So in the spring, around the spring of 1917, many French soldiers started to express their anger at how their leaders were conducting the war, and how many of them felt that they were being sent and they were being used for senseless offensive operations that had no chance of success, and so many soldiers in many divisions refused to obey orders, and they were also unhappy about living conditions in the trenches, of course. So the French government was worried, and Philippe Pétain was the person the general who was called in to try to quiet down and control the mutinies. So that was a very worrisome development in 1917 for the French. Yes, sir.
Was there any awareness in France at the time how this German resentment was exploited by the German right? And Hitler did that too. He said our troops were stabbed in the back and that sort of thing. And that's why we lost the war. And the soldiers never lost the war. But was there any awareness of that? Also in regard to after the Second World War, the Allied forces, the Allied powers really encouraged German democracy, but after the First World War, there didn't seem to be that sentiment so much.
It's a good question. I think there are different perspectives on that. In the and from the French perspective. I don't know I don't know to what extent there was an awareness. Now, the French leadership, so the French government, the Chamber of Deputies, the French politicians, most of them were when the war ended, were actually their mentality was, we want Germany to pay. Like we were unfair. Their perspective was that we were unfairly attacked. In August of 1914, our country was invaded. Our northeast provinces were completely devastated. Millions of our soldiers died, and so we want Germany to pay. We want Germany to pay reparations, and we don't care how. So I think on the French side, the official the dominant official approach was to make Germany pay, and they didn't care. In fact, Foch and other French leaders, the more nationalist French leaders, were thinking about breaking up Germany. So Germany had been united in 1871, where before there'd been all the smaller states, Bavaria, Saxony, and of course, and the bigger state, Prussia. So some French leaders in 1919, like Foch said, we want to break up Germany, create 3 or 4 little states again, so Germany will not threaten France, not attack France ever again. And the British and the Americans were against that, partly because the British and Americans still wanted there to be a counterbalance to France in Europe. If Germany had been broken up into small pieces, France would have been by far the dominant country in Europe. And so Clemenceau also wanted to make sure Germany would never attack France again, but the most Clemenceau could do was to get Alsace and Lorraine back and to demilitarize the left bank of the Rhine for a few years, get commitments from defensive commitments from the United Kingdom and as well in case France were ever attacked again. I don't. And then in 1923, of course. Poincaré, when he was prime minister again, sent French troops to occupy the Rhineland because Germany was not paying reparations. So I think certainly in the early 20s, there may have been some. My impression is that some French leaders would have been more aware of the risks, the long-term risks of resentment in Germany, but the dominant trend among the French elite and French public opinion was Germany had to pay. Now, I think in the late 20s and early 30s, when the economic situation started to improve, there was more openness towards some sort of reconciliation, both in France and to some extent, and also in Germany, with the Stresemann-Briand pacts in the late 20s. But of course, after the 1929 depression, that sort of went out the window as well in Germany. Yeah. Right after at 1918, right after the war, the dominant trend among French leadership was to make Germany pay, and I don't think there was really a concern about how the Germans felt. Yeah. Yes. Okay. Any other comment? Yes.
It's interesting to note that Germany was never invaded. It was never invaded in the First War. It was strictly an armistice. And so in effect, they did not surrender. And I think that speaks to this gentleman's point here, that perhaps there was an impression within certain using the terms that you were using earlier about Clemenceau wanting retribution and gaining it to some extent. I think that because the Germans realized that they were never ever invaded. They invaded others, but they surely weren't invaded themselves. The whole war stopped before they were invaded.
Yeah, that's correct. The armistice, when the armistice was signed on November 11,
That's right.
the Allies had not yet entered Germany. Now, the reason the Germans signed the armistice was that they knew at that stage that with the British, the American, and the French armies being on the offensive and being larger and more powerful than the German army at that point, the Germans knew that if they continued the war, Germany would have been invaded. So the Germans decided to sign an armistice before Allied troops actually entered into Germany. So the Germans signed the armistice, and then of course later in 1919 the Germans had to, reluctantly from their point of view, they had to agree to the terms that the Allies demanded through the Versailles Treaty. Germany, on the Western Front, Germany was not actually invaded. Although the Allies were certainly getting, if the Germans had not signed the armistice in November of 1918, the Allies certainly would have invaded Germany. It's interesting that the Germans, the Germans who signed the armistice were not members of the German General Staff, so they'd sent civilians, and so in a sense, the German General Staff avoided. So Hindenburg, Field Marshal Hindenburg, avoided signing the surrender document. Yeah. Yes. Oh, there was a gentleman here. Yes.
I'd like to ask. I know during the Second World War, Portugal was a neutral country. I'd like to ask if you know, during the First World War, what was the situation about Spain and Portugal regarding France? They were friends or enemies?
Spain and Portugal regarding France?
During the First World War. Because Second World War, Portugal was neutral in Second World War. So I don't know what was the position of Portugal, for example, in the First World War.
No, Portugal. It's a good question. I'm not entirely sure. But didn't Portugal send some troops in World War I?
Yes, they sent.
Yes,
but I don't remember.
Yeah.
What side they were.
Portugal would have helped the Allies, not the Central Powers. So Portugal sent a few troops to help the Allies, and Spain was neutral. So Spain was neutral in World War I. Spain was definitely neutral. Yeah, I remember reading how. Yes, I lived as a child. I lived in Spain for many years, so I spent a long time in Madrid, and I remember also reading one time that Spain was neutral, but at the time there were reports that Spanish people who tended to be more liberal would generally be supportive of the Allies, whereas Spanish people who were more conservative were more sympathetic toward the Central Powers. So it's interesting how in a neutral country like Spain, there was the people who were a little bit more liberal would be more. This is anecdotal, but it was a report that was written at the time. People who were more liberal would be more sympathetic with the United Kingdom and France. Of course, with liberal democratic parliamentarian systems, and people who were more conservative would be more sympathetic toward the Central Powers. So, of course, Germany and Austria-Hungary were a little more were sort of semi-constitutional systems, conservative monarchies, although with functioning parliaments. Yes, and you had a question. Yes.
What was the situation with the government in Germany at the time of the armistice? Hadn't it largely collapsed?
Yes, the Kaiser abdicated, I think, November 9 or something like that. So the Republic had been already proclaimed in Berlin. Yes, by the time when the armistice was signed, Germany was in complete chaos. The Republic had been proclaimed, but there was really no there was no actual. Nobody really knew what the new regime or the new government would look like. The Reichstag was still there, so that there would have been deputies and so one of the people who signed the armistice for Germany was a deputy in the Reichstag. But Germany was in a chaotic system, yes, and of course nobody really knew whether Bavaria, for example, would try to secede again, or what would Germany stay together. Nobody at that point, nobody was really sure either. And also with Germany, and on the German side, there was also concern that how would the army react? Would the German army accept the armistice? Would the German army come back home peacefully? What would the German army in Eastern Europe do? So there were many questions, very much. Many things were very much in the air. And yes, the Kaiser was already on his way to Holland, or had arrived there, and so very chaotic situation in Germany. Yeah, and yes, and also the German general staff wanted to avoid signing the armistice. They wanted the civilians to take to some extent be the public faces for that. So yeah, yes, sir.
Yeah, in Germany there was actually a socialist uprising, and it was the Social Democrats took over the Republic, and they called in the Free Corps, which were sort of fascist soldiers still, and they had them shoot in Berlin on the workers, and it was thrown down by the Social Democrats, which is a real tragedy in German history, not a failed revolution.
Well, that's correct. And the role of the Social Democrats in Germany was interesting, because in the before the war started, the Social Democrats were already the single largest party in the German Reichstag. Now, in 1914, when the war started in August, all Social Democratic deputies in the Reichstag voted in favor of the war loans, funding the war at the start. So German Social Democrats, by and large, at that time were becoming more moderate, and and so the majority of them for most of the war supported the war effort. Although of course they eventually developed some doubts, and there was some movement within Germany toward some voices advocating a negotiated peace settlement. And I think so German Social Democrats they were supportive of the German government when the war started. Yeah. Any other questions, comments? Okay.
Just another one. Was not one of the factors in the agreement to come to the armistice, or to at least negotiate an armistice, was that not the reason? Because the reason was that people in Germany were starving to death, essentially. I mean, the economy of Germany, the civilian economy, was in ruins, and everything that the government of the day, the Kaiser's government, if I can put it that way, they were just pushing all the money and everything toward the army, and to some extent the Navy, because the submarine fleet was quite large at that time. But I'm saying that within the country itself, the morale of the country was at rock bottom, even though the German army existed on the backs, if you will, of the people in terms of its support for armaments and things of that nature.
Yeah, it's correct that by 1918 the German population was having a very difficult time. I mean, in addition, of course, to the large casualties the German army was suffering, there was a blockade, so very limited. So there was a limit on supplies and foodstuffs that could arrive in Germany. So there was massive starvation as well. So many, yes, you may have heard that many German families had to subsist on turnips. Right, bread was no longer available, so they had to use turnips instead. Now in 1918, one of the things that tipped the balance was that in July and in August, the British, American, and French armies started to make these breakthroughs through the German line. And so they were using tanks, they were using some new technology. The German army was not large enough to fight the armies of three countries. And so there were some German leaders, some German military leaders were thinking of continuing to resist. They could have kept fighting, maybe retreating to the German border or to the Rhine, and kept fighting from there. But Germany decided to sign the armistice so that Germany would not be invaded. And there we can see how the German leadership in World War I, even at the end, was different from the German leadership in World War II. So the German leadership in World War I, the provisional government, the provisional Republican government in Germany, and the Reichstag, and even the military, were still rational in the sense that, knowing they were probably going to lose, they decided to sign the armistice and surrender. Whereas in World War II, of course, the German leadership at that time continued fighting regardless of the odds and regardless of the impact and destruction that was brought to Germany. So quite a different approach by the German leadership in the two wars. Yes?
Which country used nerve gas first?
From what I've read, it was actually used to a small extent in the Eastern Front, actually, against the Russians by the Germans in maybe early 1915, to a small extent. So to my knowledge, it was the Germans who used it first in the Western Front, mustard gas. Yeah, but
It was in April of 1915.
April 1915. Yeah. Any other questions or comments?
Just a note to this thing about the termination of the war. Of course, in World War II, there was a no unconditional surrender edict on the Western Allied side, whereas World War I, that wasn't the case. So it was possible to negotiate an armistice.
Yeah, that's fair.
The politics were different even amongst the Western Allies during World War I, much more accommodating to peace. And the armies of the West were in a near state of collapse as well. You talked about there was the American armies, arguably the Canadians and Australians were pretty strong, but French and British armies were flat on their backs, almost as badly off as the German armies. So I think everybody probably wanted to get into it.
In World War I,
Yeah, it's a very different situation.
There's no question that with the Americans coming in, it made a huge difference. You're absolutely right. And the British Army was on its back as well as the French.
I also tried, of course, 100 years later, it's difficult for us we can't be there. It's difficult for us to know what people were going through, but I sometimes try to think about what the French civilian population was going through throughout that year. So I think we can, if we try to put ourselves in their shoes, if we try to imagine ourselves as French civilians, we can see that many people are missing. So many men, of course, are either at the front. Many have been killed. Many have been permanently injured, wounded. So that's of course very tragic and sad. Now in 1918 though, so 1918 of course for the French was not all sad. So there was of course a lot of there were still casualties. There were still fighting. But there were some, from the French perspective, there was some good news. So they eventually won the war. The Americans started arriving in large numbers to support the Allied effort. From July, the Allies start winning all these victories against the Germans on the Western Front. So that would have been and if we can look on YouTube and find these old newsreels of 1918 in France, and we see all these celebrations, people on the street welcoming the Americans, people on the street celebrating the Armistice Day, the end of the war. So 1918 for French civilians was I think, yes, perhaps bittersweet to some extent. On one hand, there's still a lot of fighting, a lot of suffering, but on the other hand, things, after 4 years of effort, things start to look up for the French in 1918. Yes, in previous years, it was not certain that France would win the war. It was not certain that France would be able to get back Alsace-Lorraine. And so 1915, 16, 17, nobody really knew what the outcome would be. But in 1918, things for France start to look up, in spite of all the ongoing suffering and difficulties. For the French civilians, there were economic difficulties. There was some rationing. There was some increased taxation. There was a lot of hard work to supply munitions and to make sure the armies were on the field were well supplied. Now, French and British civilians overall did not go through the same level of hardship that civilians in Germany or Austria-Hungary did. So civilians in Germany and Austria-Hungary were to a large extent completely cut off from international trade, from trade with other European countries during the war, partly by the British Navy. Whereas civilians in Britain and civilians in France, in spite of some rationing, they still had some, of course, contact with international trade, with the United States, with South America, with international markets. In terms of finances, France, of course, France had to issue many had to issue many war bonds, so hoping that the public would subscribe to war bonds that the government could use to finance the war. France, of course, also had to borrow money from Britain and borrow money from the United States, and so that did add a huge load to the French government debt. And that was part of the reasons why the French were so adamant that Germany pay reparations to France, partly to help France pay back its loans that it owed to the UK and to America. So 1918 for the French civilians, yes, there's of course ongoing bad news and ongoing suffering, but some good news starts to trickle in as well in terms of progress, in terms of the war. Of course, the war ending by the end of the year. There was some. I remember reading a novel. I think the title of the novel was 1914 about some. And this novel looks at the experience of ordinary French people during the war, and the novel talks about also how some people in France and other countries too as well profited from the war. So some people who owned munitions factories or who were suppliers to the army actually got rich, and so while in war, while most people suffer, some people to some extent benefit in some way or another. Now, French leaders also. So, for example, Marshal Foch, the French Allied Supreme Allied Commander, his son-in-law had been killed at the start of the war. So, leaders also had experienced suffering at the personal, family level sometimes. Yeah. Any other questions or comments? Thank you very much. Thank you for coming, everyone. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.